Good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing? Thanks, everyone, for coming out. For anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Lauren Taylor. I manage Avel Flight School. I just wanted to point out a couple of things before we start. Fire exits, we do have one in the front, the back, and the side. For all of you who don't know, the men's restroom is out in the hangar, just in case you need to go to the bathroom. There is refreshments out front. Please feel free to grab as much as you want before you leave. And if you haven't signed in already for wings credits, that's up front as well. Luann from the FAA has asked us to let you know that they are hiring operations inspectors. If any of you guys know anyone, please let Luann know. They're looking for a lot of people, okay? Otherwise, I'm going to bring Prashant up here to start the presentation. If you guys have any questions, please come and see me afterwards, and I'll answer any of them for you, okay?
Thank you.
No problem.
Good morning. We'll start straight away. If you have cell phones and so on, if you'd like to put it on silent, please, that'd be great. Today is a nervous day for me because normally a lot of you come here regularly for our presentations. I've seen you before. I'm particularly nervous because it's difficult enough to have a wife sitting in and watching your presentation, but when she's a medical doctor, it's even more challenging. I know it's going to be a problem once I finish the seminar. She's going to point out and tell me, you did this wrong and that wrong, and you all know what I'm talking about. But either way, thank you for coming. Aeromedical factors and flight safety, it becomes very important for us to understand concepts of aeromedical factors because our performance is directly related to how healthy we are. And in the cockpit, that becomes a critical, it becomes crucial for us to be healthy. And so we're going to look at some aspects of aeromedical factors and get to know a little bit about it so we can make better decisions on whether we have to fly or not. While we're at it, there has been a change. So new, I just want to touch upon the new student pilot medical certificate. Are you all familiar with the new changes? Anybody? Yeah. Okay. Unlike previously, where you could go to an aviation medical examiner and get a student pilot certificate, that it cannot be done anymore. There's been a change in the regulation. So one has to go to an aviation medical examiner and get an aviation medical certificate anyway. So there's no change in that for now. But the student pilot certificate does not come with the aviation medical certificate anymore. So it has to, it's a separate certificate. It's going to be looking just like a plastic certificate, like a pilot certificate. There's no difference. And it has to be either issued by your flight instructor. It can be issued by members of a 141 school, such as ourselves. It can be issued by the FISDO, aviation safety inspectors, or designated pilot examiners. There is a whole list of people that we can do. So please be aware of the new changes because it affects all of us as of 1st of April. Also, for those of you who already have a medical certificate which has got a student pilot on it, you can continue to use it. The good thing about the new student pilot certificate is it does not have an expiration date on it, unlike the older ones. And also the endorsements that go on the student pilot certificate, the paper one, now it has to go on logbooks. So your student pilot certificate is going to be treated just like your plastic pilot certificates. So that's the change. Please keep in touch with that. I have students who train with us regularly, and we actually, one of the things that we have in our dispatch sheet where students have to write their weather and pre-flight planning and so on and so forth, is we actually have the I'm safe checklist on. Right? What is interesting about that is, despite the fact that we have all of these in place, very often we really don't think about, I just got a little cough, I can fly, just a little cold, a little bit of a fever, not a problem, because the weather is fantastic today. If I miss the flight today, I'm going to be missing flying. The weather's not been great the last whole week and so on and so forth, right? So even if you're Superman, there's downtime. Okay? So you have to think about that. I'd like you to think about this scenario, right? Come on in, come on in. Sorry. Look at this scenario over here. That's a bit of a funny announcement. This is your captain puking, of course. That wouldn't be the best thing you'd hear on a radio. And it's funny when you see something like this on a slide. Not so funny when you're in the cockpit trying to fly a plane and you're ill. It becomes it can lead to being a life-threatening situation. So for us to understand aeromedical factors that will help us with better judgment on go or no go becomes critical. And many factors can affect our decision to fly and how we fly and perform. That's just being ill or stressed or angry even. All these can affect our judgment. And we'll go into those details. Some of you may already be familiar with the aeronautical decision making process we have in aviation, right? We call it ADM, and we use the 3P model, which is used very heavily in training in flight schools now. And part of the perceived process performed, we use a part of the perceived process and performed 3P model that we use for aeronautical decision making. The part where we use perceive, we use an acronym called PAVE. And PAVE stands for pilot, aircraft, environment, and external pressures, right? We're all familiar with that. So when it comes to pilot, I'm not going to go into the details of the entirety of PAVE and the 3P model. I'm just going to talk about the pilot. When it comes to pilot, we use another acronym called I am safe. A lot of you are familiar with that already. So we talk about I am safe being illness. Before flying, you want to ask yourself, are you ill? Of whatever, you got a cold, fever, an ache in your body, anything that can distract you from flying. Are you on medication that can affect your reflexes, your motor skills? So you could be on something as innocent as NyQuil, for example, that can make you drowsy. And it actually says when you're actually using NyQuil, don't operate machinery, right? Some of them have tags on them. So you have to be aware of what you're using in terms of medication and see whether it's going to be okay for you to fly with it. Stress is another factor. We are going to be elaborating a little bit more into stress, but you have to make sure that you're not stressed when you're flying. And whatever that might be, you might be upset, you might be stressed because you were angry with something, whatever may be the case, whatever may be the cause of the stress, irrespective of that, if you're stressed, I would never walk towards an aircraft. So you have to think about that as well. Of course, alcohol never mixes with aviation. It's a really bad mix. It can explode pretty badly. So that we stay away from alcohol and aviation. Exhaustion, fatigue, we're going to be discussing that a little bit in more detail as well. And emotional well-being and diet are also important factors to consider before you fly. Do you remember this crash? Some of you might. It actually gave rise to some pretty big changes in regulations. Today our ATP regulations are changed, how you get an ATP and the minimum for it is changed because of this accident. Do you recognize which one this is? Oh, this was the accident that took place in Buffalo with a pilot and co-pilot. One of the main reasons the NTSB came up with for the accident was stress. Apart from a whole barrage of things that were contributing factors to the accident, one of the main things was stress and flight duty time limitation as well. Okay. And that led to changes in regulations on how an ATP should be issued, which is affecting all of us today. Do you recognize this one? I use this quite often in my slides. It's a really good example, unfortunately, on what that means. Do you recognize which one that is? JFK, yeah. And you can see it's just pulp over there. Really bad shape. And if you look at the NTSB report, JFK actually was on a cast with a broken ankle until the day he went on the trip. He just took the cast off. He was a low-hour pilot, planned for a flight in the daytime. Actually, we ended up going into night flight. Did not tune into any of the frequencies that he was supposed to have tuned. Flew over a terrain which over water, nighttime, got disoriented, and most likely got into a an unusual attitude, and that is what the NTSB found was the cause of crash. But many of the contributing factors were actually aeromedical, not just the fact that he had all the other things that he did not do right, not just the fact that his ankle was broken and took off the cast. He was under a lot of stress. His company was not doing well. He was under a lot of financial stress. He was close to bankruptcy. All this were contributing factors to a crash, stuff like that. And that ended up killing himself and 2 other members of his family, including his wife. So your aeromedical factors become so important, paramount in our decisions to fly an aircraft safely. So some of the topics we're going to be covering today, they're going to be illness, hypoxia. A lot of these topics you may be already familiar with, but it's always good to go back into them and think about it. Hyperventilation, carbon monoxide poisoning, decompression sickness, motion sickness, vision, sinus blockage, inner ear infections, alcohol, drugs, stress, fatigue, dehydration, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and contagious diseases. Some of the things that we will look at. So the first thing we look at is hypoxia. Captain Kirk not having enough to breathe, of course. He had to learn the hard way that there is no oxygen in space. But anytime you end up not having enough oxygen, it is going to be a problem. And there are largely, while there are many different ways of not having enough oxygen, hypoxia, within the FA system, if you look in our FA websites, actually it is there, we actually discuss 4 types of hypoxia that we are concerned about. And we'll just talk about that. That's hypoxic, stagnant, histotoxic, and hypemic hypoxia. So let's see what they are. Hypoxia is very simple. As you go up in altitude, the air becomes thinner. There's less oxygen content, less air content, so less oxygen content. So the amount of oxygen available for your lung to absorb becomes less as you go up in altitude. And that's one of the reasons why when you climb, how many of you do any mountaineering over here? You know what I'm talking about. So you have to climatize, otherwise your ability to absorb oxygen is not there, and you get hypoxic very easily. So that's simple. So one might ask, why is that relevant to us? That's not a very difficult question to answer, because we all fly, we go up in altitude. In fact, when you're climbing, you actually have a lot more time to climatize. When we are actually in an aircraft, especially if it's not pressurized, we get up to altitude very quickly, right? So you have to have familiarity of what that can do to you and the lack of oxygen. And I got an interesting video to show you that, once we cover this. The other one is stagnant hypoxia. It's simply, the word stagnant suggests that there is a lack of circulation. And therefore, that lack of circulation then leads to the inability for us to carry oxygen that we need. Histotoxic hypoxia is at a cellular level, where the cells that need to carry the oxygen have the inability to absorb them. And that can, some of the major contributing factors for histotoxic hypoxia is alcohol, narcotic drugs, and cyanide. And you might think, where am I ingesting cyanide? It's poison, It really actually comes from anything that you burn. Plastics, when you burn, they actually produce cyanide, and that can actually affect your health and your ability to absorb oxygen. Hypemic hypoxia is the inability of blood cells, your hemoglobin, to carry oxygen. The interesting thing over here is hemoglobin, it bonds with carbon monoxide 200 times more readily than it bonds with oxygen. So if you have carbon monoxide, what happens is your hemoglobin is overcrowded with carbon monoxide. It adheres to your hemoglobin, and therefore now you don't have the ability for oxygen to attach to your hemoglobin and get carried around. And we will speak a little bit more about carbon monoxide a little bit later, but this is a real issue for us, especially when we go in altitude. Of course, smoking doesn't help. Certainly not for that gentleman over there. He's overdoing it, I think. But if you are smoking, one of the things that you will find is your ability to absorb oxygen and go up in altitude reduces. Also, some of you may know here, have you heard about the 40-40 rule? there is a statistics about pilots losing their medical. Close to 40% of pilots lose their medical when they hit 40. Have you heard? Are you familiar with this? There is some statistics on it. But a lot of that, one of the contributing factors to that is smoking as well. So one has to keep in mind what that can be. The other way, the other ways of getting carbon monoxide poisoning is your exhaust gases. And we, as instructors, speak about it all the time. Right? When you go to a cabin, we have the possibility of having carbon monoxide poisoning. And that's another thing that we have to be aware of. So we were talking about chronic obstructive pulmonary disease earlier on. That one of the primary causes for this is smoke inhalation, of course, smoking. And the tar that you get from smoking gets deposited into these bronchioles and they block them with time. It used to be called as emphysema before. And that's a section of the lung, as you can see. Those little cavities that inhale, they're filled with tar, carbon deposits. And it looks horrible, of course. And you know, it's horrible because you're able to see it. But very often when smokers, they have the lungs inside, it's very close to how you see it over here. And because it's not visible, out of sight, out of mind, right? So symptoms for hypoxia, you got headache, drowsiness, dizziness, or a sense of well-being, or just absolute belligerence. You know, people get crazy. So get rowdy sometimes, and these can be symptoms of hypoxia. One of the gentlemen who came in for one of these seminars earlier on a couple of years ago actually told me how, when he was flying on a non-pressurized aircraft, he had oxygen with him. And he said, well, I haven't used oxygen in a while, let me try and use it. So he put it on, took a few breaths, and suddenly he said, it just shocked him how suddenly color started appearing in his vision, right? He hadn't realized his vision had gone into black and white and he was losing color vision. And he was flying somewhere around 20,000 feet. He was a seasoned pilot, he was retired. He was here in this one of the seminars that I was giving earlier on, and he was mentioning this to everybody. At the end of the seminar, I will actually open the floor for everybody to contribute to this as well and ask questions. So lack of peripheral vision and turning gray is a typical symptom, especially when you're flying, if you've got hypoxia. Blue color in lips and fingernails, so on. I'm going to play a short video. Take a look at this. Recognition of hypoxia is very difficult. People actually don't realize that you've become hypoxic. And therefore, an onset of hypoxia can be fatal for us because then you are unable to make good decisions or even fly the plane safely, and people end up dying. So I'd like to show you an experimental video over here of what happens when there's lack of oxygen. It's really interesting.
This is a risky experiment, as unconsciousness can occur quite suddenly. What's the sudden change? This tropical depression. Just recover.
Give me a second.
This is a risky experiment, as unconsciousness can occur quite suddenly. What's the sudden change? This tropical depression. Just recover. Tell me what you're experiencing. A little bit giddy. Yeah, a little bit lightheaded. Physiologist Dr. Hans Wittenberg is monitoring Michael's condition by asking him to complete basic tasks.
Can you show me by sticking up your fingers how much 9 minus 5 is?
9 minus 5 is 4.
Excellent. How much this?
That's the evasive trap.
Excellent.
Yeah. Michael's brain is suffering from oxygen starvation, making him feel drunk, euphoric, and overconfident.
Can you hold this up for me?
Oh, you can hold it up, too.
And can you put the shape in it as well?
Alright, I'm looking for... I can't see that one.
It's here. You see?
Okay.
Excellent. What kind of card is this?
It's the 3 times.
3 vials?
Yeah.
What kind of shape is it? Can you put it in?
Yes, it's the start. Michael will eventually face an ultimate test. Will he be able to switch his oxygen back on and save his life? Or will he be too far gone to care?
How much is 8 minus 3?
8 minus 3 is 4.
Is it 4?
8 minus 3... 8 minus 3 is... Michael is dangerously hypoxic.
Okay. I think it's time to recover, Mike. Can you put up the switches? 6 minutes. Put up the switches. We will die.
Just swing the mask back on.
He's experiencing what appears to be the perfect method of execution, and he doesn't care.
Put up the switches. We will die. Put up the switches. Can you tell me how you feel now? How do you feel?
I feel much better.
Very good. How much is 8 minus 3?
5, definitely 5. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, Hans, thank you. Michael.
Where are we now, Captain?
Well, actually, we're descending now to sea level again. We are at 26,000 feet.
How much longer until I would be unconscious?
Well, a matter of seconds. I guess 10 to 20 seconds, and then
And from there to death?
that's your final destination then.
If Heavens hadn't stepped in then,
He saved your life today.
Jimmy,
Be very thankful.
thank you.
But overall, Michael, was it painful?
No, I thought the experiment was a failure because I was getting all the answers right. Can I get all the answers right?
In the end, no.
Really?
Yeah.
I thought I was doing really well.
Yeah.
I thought I'd outwitted you. I certainly felt self-confident. Obviously I did, but that's evidently one of the symptoms of hypoxia. But I had no idea that I was near death. And I was just, I was very happy, very happy. Had a little way to go.
Quite interesting, isn't it? How one does not realize that, and they describe it quite well. It's one of the nicest way to kill somebody. And there is a real danger. Actually, Oklahoma have these chambers over here. You could actually go over there and get yourself a first-hand experience of how it is. There are also charts available which gives you, the term is time of useful consciousness. So at various altitudes, how much time do you have of useful consciousness? And what that is consciousness that you can actually use to actually do something sensible. After which is exactly like this guy over here. You lose your ability to do anything sensible, and there is followed by death. And once you go up to about 30,000 feet and so on, your time of useful consciousness actually drops very drastically to seconds. That's all. Once you have say a rapid decompression, for example. And as you may have seen in airlines, they tell you if you do have a scenario where there is a decompression, whether it is slow or rapid, the first thing that you want to do is get don your own mask before you help somebody else. The reason being typically over here is one can get brave and think, I can help somebody and then help myself. You will not have the sensibility and the ability to actually help somebody because you lost it yourself. The first thing you want to give yourself is help yourself with the mask. And also in airlines, many of the standard operating procedures, some of you may know, is if you're flying in certain altitudes and you've got only one pilot in the cockpit, the other one is required to use a forced donning mask. Some of, in certain scenarios, of course. So this is quite important to know what hypoxia can do. The next one is quite the opposite, it's hyperventilation. Usually, the triggers for hyperventilation is anxiety, panic, fear. When we train to be pilots, we all go through phases where sometimes we're not sure about what we do, especially in the early stages of our flight training and our exposure to flying. Commonly, you can see that when somebody's doing their first cross country and so on and so forth, or at the early stages of navigation, where there's a bit of disorientation and thinking, where am I? I'm not quite sure. People get lost. scenarios like that can be very stressful and people can panic. If you look at one of the things that we speak about in ADM, Aeronautical Decision Making, one of the things that we point out is hazardous attitudes. I don't know if you remember them. There are 5 of them. One of them is resignation, right? And what you don't want to do when you panic is you don't want to resign. You want to calm yourself. Very often people, when they panic and they're in a lot of stress and anxiety, they start breathing fast. And what that does is we need a certain amount of carbon dioxide in our blood to maintain the acidity level in our blood. We need to have a balanced pH level. But when we start hyperventilating, what happens is the excess oxygen replaces carbon dioxide, and your blood starts turning, the pH level rises, and you end up with a scenario called respiratory alkalosis, where you then start getting various symptoms that are not really good for you. We'll talk about symptoms in a minute. One of the things that divers do, free diving, where people don't actually have a scuba diving kit. Free divers actually practice hyperventilation before they dive, so that they want to load themselves up with more oxygen so that they are able to stay underwater longer. But of course, it's not really recommended. Even some anesthesiologists, when they do, before they put you under anesthesia before a surgery, sometimes they get you to hyperventilate so that they're able to more easily anesthetize you. While these may be common practices, largely it's not really helpful for us in the aviation community. So symptoms: dizziness, tingling of the fingers and toes, hot and cold sensation, drowsiness, nausea and suffocation, disorientation that can include painful muscle spasms followed by unconsciousness. So too much or less, either way is not good for us, of oxygen. So what can we do? Breathe into a paper bag. That's a very common thing that we all advise people to do, because then you recirculate some of the carbon dioxide back into your system. Talking out loud or singing if you have a good voice. I'm not quite sure people would appreciate me singing, but some people have a beautiful voice, so maybe that might not be such a bad idea. But what it does when you sing or start speaking out loud or counting out loud is it slows down your respiration, your breathing rate. And so they put your carbon dioxide levels back in balance. Remember, we were speaking about carbon monoxide poisoning. We already determined that carbon monoxide sticks to red blood cells easily, and therefore it then does not allow the oxygen molecules to then stick onto them, which is important for us. And one of the factors where we have to be careful about is your carbon monoxide poisoning in your cabin. Especially happens when you have a muffler that is quite old, got holes in them, and then you put on your cabin heating on, and along with your nice heat that you get in your cockpit, you're getting carbon monoxide as well. The danger with that is this gas is it's colorless, odorless, and the weight of this gas is very similar to ambient regular air, and so it very easily mixes, does not sink or go up, and it's almost impossible to detect. And the symptoms can be as light as headaches, nausea, dizziness, breathlessness, and there are lots of instances where people actually end up dying because they fall asleep and die very peacefully with carbon monoxide poisoning. So this is a real danger. It is a good idea for us to be aware of it. If you have carbon monoxide detectors in your aircraft, sometimes they're not reliable, but one has to be aware of it. I normally, when I use cabin heat, I don't use it for prolonged periods because of the fact that I want it. Sometimes, put it on, switch it back off, get some fresh air in. It's okay to be a little bit cold as long as you're wrapped up warm, and that's really important. So keep that in mind. There are lots of carbon monoxide detectors available in the market. Something as simple as one of those sporty pilot patches that you can stick. Make sure they're not expired, and you can get a lot more fancier as well. It depends on how much you want to spend. Decompression sickness. Now, one of the things we think about decompression sickness is typically we think about divers going and having a scuba diving, coming out and having a decompression sickness. It's not necessarily restricted to divers. Actually, decompression sickness is simply when there is a change in ambient pressure and your body is unable to cope with it rapidly. So when you're going from higher pressure to lower pressure, and you can see when I'm saying that that can be just as simple as being in a non-pressurized aircraft and you're going up an altitude. You see? It's no different to you actually diving and coming up to the surface where the pressure is lower than what you've been up there. So when that happens, inert gases in our body, they start to come out and they end up going into joints and they can cause bubbles, which can be quite painful. So the recommendation is normally you want to give at least about 12 hours or so from the time you dive to before you start flying, even if it's a pressurized cabin, because airlines, for example, pressurized cabin, what cabin pressure altitude do you normally look at in airlines? 6 to 8,000 feet, right? So it's not really set very low. You're not setting sea level pressure to set a cabin. So you're already getting into an environment. As soon as the aircraft takes off, your cabin pressure is a lot lower than sea level. So it is like being at 6,000 or 8,000 feet. So this is going to affect you directly. So even if you're not necessarily flying, please come in. Avoid it. Even if you're not flying the cockpit yourself, and you're just a passenger in an airline, please be wary of what this can do to you. And it can be quite painful. Motion sickness. It's not, it can happen to anybody. Doesn't mean that because we're pilots, we in the pilot community we have a tendency to think we're cool people. It doesn't happen to us, right? That may be true to some extent, but it's because in your inner ears, your sense of motion and balance it gets overstimulated, and then you get nausea. So when that happens, one of the best things that you can do is to focus on something really far away and fixate on something that's far away that has got very little relative motion, right? If you're in a car, you can look outside really far away on something that's moving apparently slower or almost not moving. In the aircraft, you can look at a distant cloud that's not necessarily moving, focus far away. Looking inside is not going to help you, especially when you're feeling motion sickness. Sinus blockage. So we have these cavities over here. The problem with that is if you have an infection, they can get clogged up. And then you're unable to equalize when you're going up in altitude because the air gets thinner, the pressure drops, and you have to equalize. And very often when you're flying in an airline, you see that all the time because a lot of the passengers, they're not aviators, they're not aware of the scenario. You have little children who are screaming their guts out when the plane starts descending or climbing, right? And all it takes for them is to give them something to suck on, similar to a Valsalva maneuver, right? So what you have to be aware is sinus blockages can occur because of respiratory infections, like something as cold can affect you, nasal allergies, and usually occurs during descent. Can occur during the climb as well, just as much. So if you end up having one of these and it's blocked, your experience can be very off-putting. You can get into very excruciating pain. Now, I'd like you to imagine you being in a cockpit flying an aircraft by yourself and being in excruciating pain and what that can do to your ability to fly the aircraft safely. Are you familiar with the Valsalva maneuver? Closing your mouth and your nose and blowing into it. You can try it. You'll see your ears popping. This works quite well if you don't have an infection, right? But not so if you have an infection and you got blockage. Your Valsalva maneuver may not necessarily help you if all your sinuses are blocked. So don't think this is a cure for you having an infection and then going up in the air. And that's one of the reasons when you're ill, you got a cold, this can be a serious issue. You don't want to be walking towards an aircraft. We all enjoy a nice drink, some of us, from time to time, and it's nice to relax with a drink. But in the aviation industry, alcohol in aviation are a bad mix. And you want to stay away from alcohol when you're walking towards the plane. One of the things that, so you have all kinds of consequences, short-term and long-term consequences of alcohol. Slurred speech and lack of concentration, reduction in inhibitions, confusion, memory loss, motor impairment. These are some of the problems that we can have due to alcohol, excessive alcohol or alcohol over the limits. Even if you're driving a car, forget about walking towards the plane. Long-term damage can be poisoning, liver damage, nerve damage, and brain damage. It's pretty serious. So you have to be responsible with alcohol. So I got a question for you. What's the distance between a bottle and a throttle? 8 hours? Okay. I thought it was 8 inches or so. But the regulations are very clear. It's not just about 8 hours. So if you, let us say you had a bottle of beer, right? And your clock says, it's been 8 hours since I've had some alcohol. Can you go and fly? Yeah?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. You have to be careful with that because the regulations are also very clear about it's not just a matter of minimum time gap. It's also that you should not be under the influence of alcohol. So let's say you got a little tingly headache. What do we call that after you drink alcohol? Hangover, yes. You got a hangover. Would you call that influence of alcohol? Yes, that would be influence of alcohol, right? So you can't fly. So anytime, a lot of airlines have policies where you can't actually fly for up to after 12 hours of ingesting alcohol, or some of them, they push it to 24 hours as well, more safer, right? So as a pilot, a lot of these health issues that we have, we also have to set our own personal minimums on what's safe for us. Regulations very often give you the absolute minimum. And for example, what's the visibility criteria for VFR? What's the VFR visibility?
3 miles.
It's 3 miles, right? I would be uncomfortable actually flying in 3 miles visibility, while it's legally perfectly okay for me to fly. So having a regulation that gives you minimums for legality is one thing, but safety is a whole different ballgame altogether. You have to understand what are safe minimums, your ability, and where you want to push it. So be responsible when you're having alcohol and stay away from planes. Stress, a little bit of stress is okay. Actually, it's good for us. It depends on excess stress, right? So you can see over here, low and high stress actually, if you have very little stress, and people say I have a stress-free life, actually if you've got no stress at all, you probably won't get out of bed in the morning, and you won't have any motivation to do anything. So people get complacent with what we're doing. Complacency can set in, that's a danger there as well. High levels of stress can cause fixation and confusion, which is really bad. And stress, the sources of stress can be many different sources, whatever the case is. So you have to moderate your levels of stress carefully for us to be safe pilots. Over here you see signs of stress can be change in behavior, judgment errors, making wrong decisions, lack of concentration, loss of memory, and even loss of sleep as well, which can then lead to fatigue, which we will talk about in a minute. Long-term signs of stress can be a whole range of symptoms that can manifest, including susceptibility to infection, self-medication, trying to manage your stress, and continued stress not managed well can then lead to loss in your functionality at work and in the cockpit. So it's a package. You have to think about your body and your mind, your emotions, your behavior. You have to keep sight of these when you're talking about stress. And you want to try and have a healthy lifestyle. You want to eat well. You want to exercise regularly. You want to sleep and drink plenty of water and manage your stress levels well. As a pilot, that's important for us. Fatigue. one of these factors is exhaustion. When you're really exhausted, how often have you been really exhausted and actually done something? And you think, oh my God, did I just do that? Because your ability to think and act goes away because of exhaustion. And your performance drops considerably, right? When you're on the ground and you can do something like that, it is very forgiving because we can correct it very easily. But in the cockpit, with exhaustion, it's very easy for us to perhaps maybe pull a knob that you shouldn't be pulling, right? Because you're unable to concentrate and pay attention. And rather than maybe, I have been in scenarios where maybe a student tried to pull the mixture back instead of throttling back, right? How many of you have been in this scenario, right? So that happens. So you have to think about that. Fatigue can affect us in so many different ways. And largely we categorize fatigue into acute and chronic. As you can see, that's a pretty bad scenario to be in, right? In the cockpit, where you're unable to do what you're supposed to do. But acute fatigue, in simple terms, is like it's a bit like if you run for a mile, for example. Depends on your fitness level, really. But if you have a run and you suddenly stop, you feel a sudden exhaustion. It's easy to recover from acute fatigue. Rest usually doesn't. But chronic fatigue is a lot more difficult to recognize because it's not something that happens over one incident. It's something, it really lifestyle dictates chronic fatigue. And overworking, not having enough rest, and a poor lifestyle over a period of time, you can build this fatigue over time. It becomes insidious. You're not able to pick it up, and then you don't realize your fatigue, and then you start getting into the scenario where you begin to make mistakes over and over. The difficulty with that is some of those mistakes in the cockpit can cost us our lives. Some of the symptoms that you see with fatigue are, depression, anxiety, irritable bowel syndrome, tenderness in your joints, which is fibromyalgia. So you have to, when you start having these symptoms, you must actually consider doing something about it. Like, what am I going to do? Am I going to have a change in my lifestyle? Am I sleeping enough? I have been in scenarios where people think it's okay to have a late night party. Didn't drink alcohol, I didn't touch alcohol, but I'm okay to come and fly now. Right? You're not okay to fly because you have a late night party and you didn't touch alcohol because you don't have enough sleep. Right? So you have to think about that as well. So a good way is to exercise and rest, not try and do it at the same time like this over here. Exercise and then rest, and then recovery is better with fatigue. Drugs, use of drugs, like I mentioned earlier on, you have to be careful about the drugs that you use. A lot of the drugs are not approved for flying. Over-the-counter drugs, you have to be familiar with what you're using, if you're using any. That can actually affect your motor skills, which can directly affect you in the cockpit. What you just saw on the previous slide is a definite no-no for aviation. Dehydration, of course. Drink plenty of water, because how many of you here have been in a dehydrated situation where you're not able to function? Right? It is one of those other things. We're busy with our lifestyle, we're running around, and we forget to drink. And we don't realize how much it actually affects our performance and our ability to think and do well. Of course, that is quite exaggerated, but also dehydration can be insidious as well. It's difficult to pick up, and easily we can be in a scenario where that's affecting us. Can lead to nausea, headaches, and so on and so forth. They are all very similar to, if you've noticed something, hyperventilation and hypoxia, dehydration, they have similar symptoms in many cases. So drink plenty. So I'm going to talk a little bit about vision, right? Illusion. This is an interesting thing. If you actually start focusing on one of those spots, you can see. Do you see that thing moving? Anybody can see it moving?
Nothing is moving.
Nothing is moving? Actually, I think the idea is to shift your eyes from one spot to the other. And if you keep shifting it, you're supposed to get some sort of an illusion where the snake is moving, right? Like circus, now you can see that. But the idea behind this picture is just to show you that our eyes can deceive us. And some of the things that we have in the cockpit, especially when you have low visibility, is we lose depth perception, and that can be a problem for us. How often have we read about accidents where the pilot thinks they're too high and they push the plane down? Because there's low visibility, and therefore the brain perceives that as being a lot more higher. You push it in and then you come crashing the plane down. So this is a real problem. So you have to be aware of what the tricks that the eye can play on your mind, on perception of depth and so on and so forth. The other thing that you want to be aware of also, a lot of you will be already aware of, is how your eye adapts to color and night vision. You have the rods and cones. Of course, the rods being on the peripheral vision and your cones in the center, which recognizes color. So during daytime, we actually focus directly at things and see. And so when you're scanning for traffic in the cockpit, when you're looking for traffic, you want to be looking directly at where you're scanning for traffic. Nighttime, of course, when you're scanning for traffic, you want to look at relative motion on your peripheral vision, right? One of the things that you want to be also aware of, especially when it comes to night vision, is it takes time for the eyes to adapt to night vision. How long do you think that takes? 30 minutes. About 30 minutes, right? So you want to keep your eyes adapted to night vision, especially when you're going flying. You want to use light that's not very bright. Don't directly stare into bright lights, because then you lose the ability to recognize in your cockpit. Even something as simple as you have a circuit breaker or a little switch that you need to switch on, and it's all it's labeled, right? But what is the ability to actually read it? Because we have to be able to read in the cockpit. So at night time, if you lose night vision and you lose adaptability easily because you expose yourself to a bright flashlight on your pre-flight, this becomes a problem. So be mindful of that. Spatial orientation is another issue because we have quite a few accidents because of spatial orientation or lack of. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. Spatial orientation can be the way we orient, know which is up and down, left and right, forward and backward. We get our information from different sources, such as your vision, your inner ear balance, which is your vestibular and proprioceptive information. So we'll talk about that also. Visual actually gives you depth perception, right? So we know how far we are, especially we have 3D vision, so it gives you depth perception. You also have the balance as well, that gives us orientation. And we have proprioception. What is that? It's a combination. For example, we've done this experiment before. If you want to take your hands up and try and touch your finger back, try it right now. Try and see if you can touch your finger back over here. How many of you can do that? Right? Most of us can do that, right? Okay. Isn't that interesting that you can do that? That you're not actually able to see your fingers, but you're able to touch it. And that's a good example of proprioception, because we are then actually able to have an idea of what is up and down, where things are around us. How often do we talk about this, especially when you're doing instrument flying? Loss of orientation, right? This cockpit, you go in there, and it's telling you all kinds of things. It's telling you this plane is pitching up, pitch it down right now. This plane is spinning around this way, so let me correct it. That plane's not doing anything, it's flying perfectly level. So we can take a very nice, perfectly flying level plane and pitch it down and crash it or put it in a spin because we're having all these illusions. Right. So let's be careful with that. Contagious diseases. We have to take some responsibility, especially when we're ill. You've got a viral fever. Don't walk into an environment and be generous about passing it on to other people. You can be generous other ways. If you want to give me some money, I'll take it from you. Don't give me a virus. Okay? Especially cockpits are very confined environments. How often have you traveled in an airline and come out and you catch a cold? Right? We At some point, some of us have experienced that. Because you end up in a closed cabin, a lot of the air is circulating, and then you have people coughing, and sneezing, and everything is spraying everywhere, and then you inhale it, and then you end up walking away with something that you didn't have earlier. So when you're in a cockpit environment, be mindful of that, because you have somebody else sitting in close proximity, or if you're coming into a flight school or a flying club, or an organization where you're going to walk off with other people, please be mindful of that. Some of the other things that we can think about is simple things such as sprains and spasms, right? If you got a sprain, maybe an ankle sprain, maybe a wrist sprain, it might seem simple, but these things can become a real issue once you're going into your cockpit. How many of you are multi-engine rated over here? Any multi-engine rated pilots? Yeah. You know what I mean? What happens when you lose an engine on a multi-engine, right? That's a lot of rudder, yeah. A lot of rudder, a lot of pressure. And not necessarily just on a and if you have an ankle sprain, for example, however mild it is, it becomes really magnified when you lose an engine. And now you're not able to keep your heading. And you will, very often, you know the saying, what happens when you lose an engine on a multi-engine? The other engine takes you very quickly to the site of the crash, right? So, so you have to be aware of these things and generally think about your health, because it is important for you to understand that being healthy in aviation, both mentally and physically, affects your performance, and for you to be safe pilots, that's important. I'm going to open the floor so everybody can contribute whatever your ideas are, ask me questions, and I'll try and answer to the best of my ability, but I'm going to open it to you. We'll have a discussion, and then we'll wrap it up after that. You're welcome to contribute anything to it if you want to add to my presentation.
Well, that's the first time.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Diet is very important, especially to pilots. Has there been any studies or any information that you could share with us about what pilots should not eat or should eat? Or?
I can actually tell you an incident, an interesting incident. I had a student that I was training in Texas earlier on. In fact, he was an Egyptian engineer who'd come in for flight training. Never eaten a pizza before in his life. So a hot day, I'm taking him out for flying. Come over, and we go up in the air, and he throws up in the cockpit on a 152. Interestingly, when he was throwing up, he tried to open the window as well and try and throw up. I cannot tell you what that does to the vomit that comes out. It turns into a jet spray of vomit all over. Right? So we landed the plane and got it back. I got the gentleman to wash the inside and out. We had a very fine spray of vomit on the outside of the entirety of the fuselage on the outside, and bits and pieces of chicken and pizza all over inside as well. Right? So I asked this gentleman, what do you eat? He said, pizza. That's not such a bad thing to do. You know, it's a good thing to actually not. It's important to not. You know, because I advise people and say, don't go on an empty stomach, because that affects your decision making. You're right. You have to eat properly. And so then I asked, so you're not. You know, is that something that you're not used to? Because I suspected that he may not have been used to eating a pizza. He said, no, I want to try a pizza. I said, that seems like an awful lot of pizza everywhere. How much did you eat? He said, I ate a whole pizza. Right? So, and you're right about it, because you have to think about what you're eating, because I'm not able to give you specific data on that, but it is an important part, because part of your IAM Safe checklist is on the IAM SAFE is eating as well. So you don't want to go on an empty stomach, because you don't want to get hypoglycemic and lose the ability to think clearly and act clearly. You don't want to have a shivering hand, especially on the cockpit. So eat healthily, just the right amount, so that you're able to function well.
Do airline pilots have some special You know, if they're gonna have an overseas flight, do they eat some particular way or?
Well, it is my understanding that one of the things that airline, between the captain and the co-pilot, is they have different sources of food. Purely because to avoid a scenario where both of them end up ingesting the same food and they end up getting food poisoning from it, which can happen if the packing and the source of cooking is from the same. So you have a first officer and a captain, and the food that's supplied to them are from two different sources. To avoid a scenario where both of them end up in a food poisoning scenario, and then both of them get incapacitated to fly. Anything else that you'd like to add?
How do you think that this third-class medical reform, which assuming it passes, is going to affect all this with people that either aren't getting medicals or their whole situation is a little different?
Personally, I'd welcome it. Personally, I'd welcome it too. I think a lot of people would. The gentleman here is asking me about the scenario where we're trying to get rid of the third-class medical, which I think would be welcome, because I think I'm not one for necessarily, it's not about policing. I think we have to take responsibility to how we do things in life. If we can drive a car, most of you would agree that operating an aircraft is not that different to driving a car. The responsibilities and how you do things are very similar. So if you can actually maintain your health, I mean, take for example even a third-class medical. For example, we get a third-class medical, but that doesn't automatically give us a right to walk to an aircraft and fly, does it? Just because we pass a medical, you could pass a medical a month ago, and then this month you're ill and you're not able to fly. Is it okay for us to fly? It's not. It's still our responsibility to decide whether it's okay for us to walk towards an aircraft. So I'm all for the idea that we can be done with this whole third-class medical. I think it's good for the aviation industry. A lot more people who have the ability to fly quite safely even now, who are grounded, will then be allowed to fly. I'm totally for it. I hope it comes through. And I don't think it will. I think it will be a positive thing for us.
What's the status of that? Do you have any?
We're still.
It passed the Senate. A version of it passed the Senate. Yeah. That's the senator from Oklahoma, Inhofe or something. The House version was a little different, but it didn't pass. So
we'll have to wait and see. I think a lot of people are waiting to see where it goes. I think AOP is supporting it quite strongly as well. So we'll see.
Did you say 40% of pilots lose their medical by 40?
There is global statistics on that, 40-40, yes. It comes from various sources, but it's not necessarily a third-class medical, it's a first-class medical that they lose. So they have to downgrade to a third-class medical very often. We're talking about airline pilots. Anything else? Well, if you have anything else that you'd like to discuss outside of this presentation, you're welcome to contact me. Otherwise, we'll wrap up for the day. Yep. We do presentations once every few months on a regular basis. You're always welcome. Tell your friends about it as well.